It's 2016 and the Stellaris developers have decided to add, for some reason, a set of giant space creatures in their game about building badass empires and exploring the universe. A somewhat weird concept to add until you realize that Paradox probably needed a little bit more time to finish the masterpiece that's Utopia, and probably pulled some assets from the recently killed off Rune Master, and it all starts to make a little bit more sense. Anyway, this expansion came out back in 2016, back when Stellaris still had a tile-based economy, which I know just by mentioning it is going to rile up a very specific group of people, but we'll poke that hornet's nest some other time. What I'm trying to say here is this expansion was made for a game that does not really exist anymore. So in a world that's seen nearly a decade of expansions, is Leviathan still worth the money you'll be shelling out for it, or should you be getting it in a bundle or a sale? Leviathans introduced the concept of guardians, creatures in space of various sizes that would act like mini-bosses during gameplay. You enter its system, usually losing your assigned ship in the process, then wait for half the game until you have enough firepower to clobber it and take its reward. The problem with a lot of these is you would never be quite sure when it would be a good time to go and fight them, which means that you could probably claim the reward way past the point of its usefulness. Now, thankfully, these days, you can take a Leviathan down and you get a little parade situation, which is a cool little fluff event where you get to make some choices to get some more cool stuff, but you still have the difficulty of trying to figure out on what would be the optimal time to take one down. At its most basic, you have the Asteroid Hive, which is a star system with a suspiciously large amount of minerals. Long story short, it's a giant honeypot designed to trick you into mining it, which then will trigger the quote-unquote hive, which is hiding, and then, you'll be forced to do some pest control and rebuild the whole thing. It's a little bit weird as well, as you don't really get anything outside of the system and its resources, which in the larger context of Stellaris is really not all that abnormal. The automated dreadnought is kind of in the same boat, as it's a larger ship with a decent amount of firepower that you can kill, retrofit, and merge with your fleet. However, as with any other unique ship in the game, you can easily lose it if you're not being careful, so it's better to have it as like a little museum piece for you to enjoy, as it doesn't really scale well against late game fleets, and you can't really upgrade it, which means that you're stuck with its basic layout forever or until it dies, because you cannot get it back once you lose it. Meanwhile, the Spectral Wraith is a little bit more interesting in that it actually has some unique mechanics. It roams from system to system, and it can spawn in 3 different configurations, each having different weaknesses, which basically boils down to it's easier to defeat in a system that has a star that correlates with its color. On paper, this is really cool, as actively hunting down this creature and pouncing on it at the precise time when you want to kill it is really interesting. Sadly, you can murk it anytime outside of a system it is weakened, making the whole Simon Says color matching game completely pointless, and it really does not add a lot of challenge, because it is effectively really weak. Continuing potentially pointless experiences, the Dimensional Horror can give you jump drives if you kill it, which is cool and all, but by the time that you have the firepower to deal with it, any competent player will already have access to the technology, which basically makes it pointless, as you've just sacrificed most of your fleet on something you don't need anymore or are about to get organically anyway. And sure, you can get a relic out of it, except it's the worst one in the game, and did I mention that its parade event can turn your capital world into a ruin? Yeah, on paper it's very cool, in execution, just don't bother. On the side of more interesting things, however, the Stellarite is absolutely badass for a couple of reasons. It's basically the emerald weapon for Final Fantasy VII, as it randomly just shows up out of nowhere and starts kicking your ass. Basically, you just casually pop into a star system, it spawns, you lose your science ship, and you just set the place to do not enter. Now, if you do kill it, you can get a bunch of habitable worlds in its system, but that's just boring. Instead, you can get a special spy operation which allows you to destroy any Empire capital star, which is just so Dr. Evil, and I absolutely love it. You know how certain games have a thing in them that everybody just directly associates with it, but it's not really about that thing? Like Portal's got GLaDOS, Doom's got the BFG 5000, and Star Fox has got barrel rolls, and for Stellaris, for some reason, it's Space Dragons. Now, I don't know how it happened, but at some point, it just became a thing. Now, Leviathans introduced the game to these things, and killing it gives you an egg, which hatches, and as you guessed it, you can get your own little Drake out of it. You can also get some new armor tech as well as a relic, making the Space Dragon the most fleshed out Leviathan in this DLC, and its model is so good that the dev team decided to recycle it for other events as well. Finally, the Enigmatic Fortress, which is probably the coolest thing in the entire game, and yes, this is a hill that I'm willing to die on. It's a giant space station which, when you beat it, will send you on a mini RPG adventure that will most likely end with you blowing up an entire star system or running home with some unique ship components. To me, this thing is so iconic that you could build an entire squad tactics or point-and-click adventure game around it. Give me a team of 10 devs, a decent budget, and I will get you a kick-ass game around this place. But I digress. This brings the total tally up to 8 space creatures, and they're just such a mixed bag. Sure, most of them have a cool model, but they're also generally just a mindless space creature you have to murder and then parade their corpse around on your homeworld. It's not exactly rocket surgery. This is such a missed opportunity as well, because clearly some thought was put into the fortress and the sphere. The dimensional horror is somewhat expanded upon in Horizon Signal, and there were several updates made over the years, but it's just strange to see such a lack of actual content outside of shoot alien, receive bacon. Moving on, however, the expansion also introduces Enclave, which you can get in 3 different flavors. The Artisans, which are objectively the best ones in the game, as they can give you permanent unity bonuses on your planets, and they can also steal everything that is not bolted to the ground if you decide to get them to party on your planets. Then there is the Traders, which used to be the best thing you can get in this expansion. Back when you could build ships with minerals, these guys allowed you to convert energy into set materials, effectively buying entire fleets at a drop of a hat. This was horribly nerfed into the ground when the economy system was completely reworked, and now these guys are basically useless, allowing you to get some additional strategic resources for money, or if you have the Paragons expansion, some additional leaders. Long story short, they're just not worth it anymore. Finally, the Curators can give you a flat science bonus of 10%, which is just worth it on its own. Plus, if you pay them in Cold Hard Space Cash, they will give you the ability to kill space monsters a little bit more easily. There's also a couple of other bells and whistles that are unlocked with other DLCs, but for Leviathans, when it comes to Enclaves, that's basically it. And here is the thing, the Enclaves are just there to make your life easier. They don't add challenge, they don't give you new things to do, they just power scale your experience by giving you bonuses, which by themselves is a pretty boring addition. Then the final thing that this expansion adds is the War in Heaven, where 2 fallen empires awaken and they can go to war with each other, and this only occurs about 50% of the time, and when it does, it sets the entire galaxy on fire, and you can join other empires in their fight or run for the hills and stay neutral, which usually means that you can join a third faction which fights both powers. It's a massive endgame slog that takes forever and hasn't really been touched ever since it was introduced with this expansion. Also, expect the Crisis Empire to show up halfway through this war. So you may ask, ASpec listing features is one thing, but how does it actually play? I'm glad you asked. Let's do a quick playthrough recap on a game I played earlier with just Leviathans enabled, just so we can find out what the vanilla plus Leviathans experience is like. We'll quickly knock out a couple of colonies and rapidly start to expand around us because we want to gain as much relevant territory as possible with all those juicy resources. You know, the basic stuff. 25 years in, I encounter my first Leviathan content, which is a trader enclave, which allows me to get some gas at market price. Sure, I can get some cool leaders out of it if I strike a deal, but right now I've got no use for the gas and money is also tight. Then, 69 years into gameplay, I finally make first contact with the first real Leviathan in the game, and of course it's a dimensional horror, which means it's useless. Long story short, a couple of decades later I have the firepower to kill it, and I get jump drives, which I was about to get anyway. At this point, it just feels like another creature I've encountered. There have been neutral enemies, expanding robots, weird monsters, amoeba, space Wilhelm systems that are just infinitely more interesting than this Leviathan. It has lost its regality, if that's even a word. It's become commonplace to find stuff like this in space, and it's just no longer special. At least not in a way when it was the first time it came out. The problem with Leviathans is that it's been overshadowed by far superior expansions that add loads more content and power scaling for the same price. What you will also find is that 7 years of adding new stuff to the base game has made Leviathans not really stand out amongst the crowd. They're no longer the main attraction during your playthrough. Where there was once a galaxy that was fairly empty, there is now dig sites, neutrals, space weather, and the list just goes on and on. Leviathan suffers from a strong case of history marches on. It's a DLC made for a much emptier galaxy that just gets drowned out by all of this content that has been organically added over the years. And sure, it's received some love because there's some of the bonuses were moved to relics, parades were moved to situation to keep the content a little bit fresher, but beyond that, the expansion simply does not bring enough to the table. It's fancy models that equate to a few events, minor trade, and the potential for a massive endgame war that's more boring than exciting. There is no civics, there's no origins, there's no dig sites, there is no other advanced story mechanics added to the expansion that really add the depth that later ones do. The Leviathans need some serious love, and anybody who will buy it is not really going to notice its content beyond a few road bumps and pop-ups that you will see in an ocean of things that now come with the vanilla game. It used to be a must-buy, but now, considering the options available, it's probably better to wait for a sale. Sadly, this is a case of a live service game because that's what Stellaris has become, outgrowing its early content. Content that should probably be merged into the base game at this point.